And we're back. It's COMP305. It's week 2, lesson 2, part 1. And today we're going to talk about, the first part of it anyway, we're going to talk about assignment 1, which is pretty exciting, right? Let's see how we go with this one. So what is this assignment 1 that I speak of? Well, you can find it on your eCentennial, like I said. It says it's a 2D space shooter. That's what it is, 2D space shooter, right? It's due class 4, which is Friday, October the 2nd of 2015 at midnight. 10% of the value. Remember, we only have 4 assignments officially, right? And a bunch of little tests and stuff like that, and some labs that we're going to throw in there. Again, I'll be sharing the updated lesson plan or course plan. Call it a syllabus if you like, right? That I'm probably going to be doing. I'm just a little bit behind, trying to get all that done. So we're using this space shooter tutorial as a basis, as a template, if you will. So let's, some of you didn't do it. Actually, let me rephrase that. Most of you didn't do it, right? I understand people are busy, but when I ask you to do homework, even though there's no mark assigned to it, it's because I need you to do it. This course is packed, so full of stuff to learn, and it's to your detriment if I ask you to do something and you don't take care of it, all right? I could make it a mark if you like, but everyone wouldn't have got that mark for this weekend. I was just testing. Let's see how the waters go. If I just tell them they need to do it, how many of you would have got the mark? And I know there's only a handful that have started or have done it. Who started but didn't finish? How about that? There's a better kind of census. Please get it done as soon as possible. You'll need to do this. In order for you to get this assignment done, you'll need to do the tutorial, right? There's no question about it. You'll have to build it. Actually, part of it is actually building the tutorial up. So if you haven't done it, then you need to do it, right? And so understand how this tutorial thing works, okay? So the game must include enemies for the player to avoid and or destroy. A scoring system must also be included, and you must use your own graphic and sound assets, not the assets included with the space shooter tutorial. That means I'm not asking you to make your own. You could if you wanted to, but I'm asking you to get your own, all right? Which means find some assets that work for you, right, for the game. Now, you're not going to make a 2D space shooter, right? This is the space shooter is what we've got here. You're going to make your own shooter, your 2D arcade game, whatever it's going to be. So you make it your own, right? Now, you're in here, if most of you are in here to make games, this is your chance for the first game that we're going to make together that's due in a couple weeks, right? Which means I want you to make it your own, all right? So think about a concept, think about a game you like that's a shooter type game that you want to make, okay? This is an individual project. This is not something that you're going to be sharing with somebody else, right? So something that you're going to do on your own. And there's a couple piece parts here that I want you to do. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit, and I'll go over it with you, right? And then I'll go over the space shooter game, the tutorial itself, right? I'll go over it because I've done the tutorial and I've looked at the tutorial. It's pretty good. It's definitely a 2D game, very simple game, but it can be, there's a few complexities around it, eh? Like I found that when you do it, there's some stuff that you've seen, from a C# perspective. When you look at it, you're like, that ain't C#, right? Someone said last week when I was together with you guys, and maybe it was the other section, that said, well, how come we're not learning C++? Well, you know what? If you were to do Unreal and C++, you'd be like, that's not C++, right? It isn't. It's an API, guys, which means, yes, it's written in C#, but it's an API. You've got to follow the Unity lifecycle for, from an event perspective, Unity event lifecycle. And that's what you're really following. All the methods that you're going to see in the space shooter, you're going to have to understand. You're going to have to decouple and understand some of those methods that are out there. So when you, or deconstruct might be the better word, to understand what's going on. Okay, we'll go over that in a bit. Okay, so I've broken out the marks for you line by line. So a gameplay screen. Notice that there isn't a game start screen or game end screen. I can't get you to do that yet, but it's coming. All right, it's coming. So if you learn how to do it, that may be a great bonus, right? Because Space Shooter doesn't really do a game begin screen with, with a UI and all that stuff. It doesn't do that, but we're going to get there because that's part of a game screen, right? We see different game states. You start off and you have the game screen and you move into another scene. Well, these are new scenes, and we haven't talked about scene management too much, not at all, actually. And that's why you have to kind of start off with this basic one, okay? Now, this is a lot to chew, this one. This assignment's going to give you A lot of work to do to understand what's going on, especially when you start replacing graphics and they don't work or something goes wrong, right? And you'll understand what I'm talking about when you start to do that. Okay, so it says the background will scroll in one direction only. Yeah, it does. If you notice, the space shooter actually scrolls. There's some stuff that scrolls down at you, right? So you can decide which way you want to scroll, whether you want to scroll left or right, top or bottom, top to bottom, whatever you like. That's your thing. Diagonally, right? As just something different to do. For God's sakes, give me something different, right? Actually, you know, I'll use the old Hollywood theme again, which is give it to me the same, only different, right? Right? That's what we all do. We've seen the same superhero movie about 100 times, but just a little bit different, right? Yeah, I know it's Daredevil, but it's really Batman, right? You know, so just with a different scale. Player control of an avatar, a vehicle, or character. Again, you can decide what you want to use. In the space shooter game, we have a vehicle, but there's nothing that says you can't use a character with something scrolling down at them. And now that almost becomes, you can almost turn it into a platformer. I'm not asking you for a platformer game at this point. And there's a reason for that, because there's a whole other set of things you need to do to create that environment, all right? Again, one of the things I like to do with you is project-based learning, which is, so this is like kind of a mini project to do. Okay, computer control of the enemies. Now I said simple AI in brackets. I mean like really simple AI, where it's random. Random AI might have been the better one, right? There's no AI at all. The enemy should be abundant enough to challenge the player, but not impossible to beat. I think I use that in a lot of my games that I ask you to make. Random placement of items to collect. This is something new, all right? So this is kind of a new piece that you're going to have to add in that is not included pretty much in the space shooter. You don't collect any random items in the space shooter, I don't believe, right? So this is something you're going to need to do to collect a random item, something that's like a pickup, a coin, something that happens that comes up to give you to generate additional points for the player, right? A scoring system, which you already have a scoring system in the shooter, but I want you to make your own. Like for example, it has to make sense. I don't want you to give me the exact same scoring system from the shooter because it may not make sense for your game that you're making, right? Some kind of life counter for yourself or health status. There's got to be something like that. I'm not sure if it's included right now in the shooter. We'll talk about that. And some sound effects for collisions with the enemies and collecting points. A note on that. The problem with the space shooter right now is it uses particle effects for its explosions, which is cool, right? Now you're going to ask me, Tom, do I have to make my own particle effects? And for now, the answer is no. That's the only thing that I would allow you to reuse from the space shooter. If you really wanted to make an explosion and you want to use the space shooter's particle effect system, which I will preview for you in a bit, all the power to you. You can do that. I'm not going to make you new particles because it's yet another complexity for you to master. And so it doesn't make any sense for you to do that today, right? Here's some internal documentations. 5 marks, right? Please don't forget to do this because remember, there's 2 parts to this, right? There's the physical objects you're going to have to bring in, and there's also the scripting, which is pretty heavy on this one, right? So I want you to make sure you comment in your scripting. Remember, it's the same regular comments that work in C#. So / / for the comments and so on. I want you to put some comments in there about different things. Like for example, if you have for different file names, I want you to have your author's name, your last modified by, all this stuff in every file that you use. Okay, because in the future you might be sharing a project with somebody else, and somebody else might do the revision and not you, right? Why am I making you do this? Because I want you to prove that it's you, right? I want you to tell me this is your stuff. By the way, when it comes to this kind of stuff, plagiarism is high, right? So I would really ask you to make it your own code. It would be bad if I caught you taking code from somebody else. I'm just going to say that one time. I don't want to say it again. Here's one. Ensure you include a header for all your classes and methods to explain what's going on. And the reason for this is because it's not just for me to understand what's going on. It's for you to categorize what's going on. When you start explaining for yourself, you start learning what's going on in the game, right? From a deep learning perspective. Ensure your program uses contextual variable names. You have no choice, but just in case you decide to use X's and Y's, they have to be real. There's a reason why using X's and Y's and Z's. Ensure you include inline comments that describe elements of your UI design for your 2D game. All right. So any kind of, if I'm putting some kind of design aspect in, if I'm loading a spaceship or doing some kind of if there's a mule that's coming down and dropping on the player's head and that's what it is, all right, that's your game, then explain to me what's happening. Is the mule being generated? What's happening? Here's something that's new for you. An external document. Now we haven't, who have you guys learned about game design documents yet? Anybody? Yes, so there's maybe one person, maybe two. This is kind of a short form game design document. Now there's a couple places we can get these things. I can certainly provide one for you. I have a game design document that I can throw up on eCentennial if you like, or you can make your own. But what it needs to have is the following: a company logo. Okay, that means you have to make your own logo, guys, right? This is the same logo that I want to see for all your stuff that you make for me, okay? And I do this for a couple reasons. One, and I don't expect you guys to be logo designers. Hey, I'm talking about a simple logo. We're talking about like simple. It could be just your name with an X, something like simple, right? Make it your own though. It's got to be your own colors. Please don't copy it from somewhere else or steal an image from some video game you like and put it in there. Please make it your own as much as you can and keep it as simple as you can. Half a mark for that one, right? Table of contents, right? So your actual document has to be a document. A version history. I would also accept things from GitHub here. So if you're going to use GitHub, and one of the requirements is GitHub, we're going to talk about that today, how to store your stuff up on GitHub, and who's got a GitHub account? Lots of people don't. So get one today. Maybe we'll make that a lab today. Get a GitHub account. Will be a lab and make it worth 2.5% today of your final mark, okay? Because it's important for you to have a GitHub account if you don't have one. Okay. You're going to go into detailed game description. So talk about your game, how it works. Is it a top-down shooter? What kind of game is it? Talk about the controls. I mean, I've asked you to use WASD, maybe a space bar for firing, or control for firing, or maybe it's your mouse that helps you fire, the weapons or whatever you have, right? I want at least 3 screenshots for your game, right? Let me go back to interface. I'll go back to that. Let's talk about interface sketch. Show me in wireframes. Let's talk about some wireframes, some technology that you're going to use to sketch out your game. Okay, it can be very simple, and we'll talk about some places to get that stuff in order for you to do your interface sketch. Then some screen descriptions. So this is different than a wireframe. Interface sketch is like you physically sketching what this thing is about in a very blocky way at the very minimum. And then some screen descriptions describing different states. Like for example, when your game starts, what happens? Show me a screenshot. And then during gameplay, give me a screenshot of that, and give me the screenshot when your player dies or the game is over, right? We're not talking about 3 scenes necessarily, just 3 game states, because in Space Shooter you have these 3 states where you have to kind of start, and then you have your gameplay, and then what happens later on. And sometimes it's just because there's a slow start. There's no enemies on the screen, and you might just show your ship in the beginning. That's fine. Later on, we're going to use the same patterning when it comes to other assignments. So once you've done this one and you do your game design document, you can use the same template that you're going to develop for the next assignment and the next assignment. Okay. Talk about your characters or vehicles, your avatar. Show me an image, right, of your avatar. Talk about your enemies. What do they look like? How do you score? Talk about your sound index. Where are you going to get your sound clips? Or did you make them yourself? Or did you get them from somewhere? How about your art multimedia index? Where did you get all your assets from? And give some credit to where credit's due. If you're going to use Kenny's assets as an example, or if you're going to open game art or whatever, give these people some credit because they've worked on these things. All right, so that's really a lot of marks. Okay? There's 8 marks here out of 41. That's almost like a quarter of your marks on documentation, internal. Actually, it is more than a quarter, internal and external, of your project, right? Which means I want you to document stuff. And this is one of the things that all students find trouble with. They have trouble doing this because they hate it, right? I hate documenting my work. I just want to do it, Tom. How come I just can't do it? Sorry, guys. It doesn't work like that in real life, right? You need to actually document what you do, right? And whether you're doing an application or one of these. And the last piece is GitHub. I want you to demonstrate version control best practices or revision control best practices by sharing your stuff on your code on GitHub, which means I want you to make a repository on GitHub. I want you to put your files up there. That's 2 marks, right? Just putting your files up there, right? And then every time you make a change to your files or whatever, throw them back on GitHub, okay? And there's ways of doing that by sharing your whole repository up there or your whole project up on GitHub, even your images and everything else. Now you might say, hold on, if I put my stuff on GitHub, people will steal it, right? Again, I don't expect you to make the next great game, all right? It's just around sharing information with me so I can always go quickly look at your code and all that kind of stuff. Remember, you're going to be wrapping all this stuff together at the end and throwing it up on eCentennial as a final project that I will open up with my Unity and make it work. If your game doesn't open in my version of Unity, at least I can look at your files and stuff, or maybe somehow it's just a backup for me, so that way I can always look at your GitHub just in case somehow you forgot to load it up on you know, on your eCentennial or vice versa. Okay. Here's some optional game features, like taking it further. If you're really a go-getter, right? Empower the computer-controlled enemies to fire bullets back at you, right? Include a final boss monster to avoid if you want to go there. So you kill a few enemies. Let's say you make a limit, 20 enemies, and then there's the boss monster. Like, that's how simple it could be, right? And then add some power-ups to the player's avatar, like maybe extra speed or shield or some kind of weird things that you know, to make it more interesting, right? It's not required. It's optional. Add a cool soundtrack to the game, right? You want to add a soundtrack to make it, you know, more interesting, then add it in. It's a bonus, right? And allow the game to scroll in any direction in response to the player's control instead of just one direction. Because right now I'm just asking you to scroll in one direction, whichever way you want, right? But this way, imagine if you can scroll anywhere you want, right? Like any direction by stuff. Okay, so I need the external document in MS Word or PDF format only. I'm not going to accept open document format, okay? And the other thing is I want you to zip up your files, right, and put them up on eCentennial, or I think might be the best way to say it, give me your project files on GitHub, and I think that's the preferred method. I'd like to see them on GitHub. It's easier than actually putting them up on eCentennial and downloading it from there, and it's available anywhere. Okay, this thing is worth 10% of your final grade. All right, so when you get this done, it's you know you're going to stand. It's going to be done again 2 weeks from now, October 2nd at midnight, or 2.5 weeks to get it done. Late submissions, 20% per day, right? So if you don't hand it in by the Friday, as an example, and you handed it on the Saturday, 1 minute past midnight, it's out of 80%. Sunday, it's out of 60%. Monday, it's out of 40%. Please don't be late on your stuff. I've got a pile of work this semester to mark, and if you're on time, I'll be on time, okay? So I'd like you to try and get it done from that. And there's a note here on external code that I put in. It's almost like a little disclaimer. If you're going to use external code that's not part of what we've shown you already here in class or whatever, and you want to use something that you've found somewhere else because there's some neat functionality, and you don't want to reinvent the wheel, or some kind of API or library that you want to tap into, please let me know, and I will approve it or not. Okay? Don't try and do it on your own thinking, yeah, it's okay. Tom said it's not okay. It has to be your own code unless I say otherwise. All right? And that's it in a nutshell. So that's really assignment 1. Any questions around that? Yes?
Are we allowed to use assets from the asset store?
Absolutely. Assets from the asset store, absolutely allowed. Right? That's a great question. And the reason for that is because, and we're going to talk about the asset store a little bit today, there's some great assets out there, and we're not in the business in this particular section, in this particular class. It's out of scope to create great assets. We're going to understand how to manipulate assets in Maya and in Blender and in other asset creation programs. And you may have to do that anyway. But it's okay if you get stuff right from the asset store in Unity, and for the Unity asset store, I'm totally fine with that for this assignment. Okay? Anyone else have any interesting questions? How about the guys in the back? How about Vanessa? Any questions, Vanessa? Are you concerned? Right? Shouldn't be any concerns because you're getting a pile of code. Like, you're starting off with like the space shooter tutorial. Now, you guys didn't do your tutorial, so now there's extra work to be done, right? Because you haven't done it for the most part. Now, there's some challenges around that. If you're not a great coder, you might say, well, I'm not really great at C#. Guys, it's non-traditional C#. Like I said, you have to understand the API. That's it, all right, for this one. And that's why your skills are so transferable. Even though you're learning C#, not C++, who cares? At the end of the day, once you understand that you have to understand this API for your game engine, it's transferable skills. Once you see one game engine, they're very similar across all platforms, okay? So this is what the challenge is. Before we end this video, let's get into what the space shooter is, where do you get it, and all that kind of stuff. I mentioned it last week. I put it up on the video, but maybe some of you didn't see it. Let's go to that unity3d.com learn, if you follow me here, up on the web. And if you want to go to it, it's under tutorials. This is where you can start off right now. There is a fast and dirty way to do this. And if you actually right from a working version. You don't have to make it. But that's bad, right? If you start off with a working version and try and just modify what you have, because you won't understand a thing. You won't get it. These guys, this is actually a pretty good tutorial. They step you through everything from setup, setting up the project, to adding backgrounds, to creating shots and shooting shots, to managing your, you know, your enemies or your hazards. That's what they really call them, right? And so on. Okay? Even audio, the whole thing. This is kind of from an A to Z little project to kind of show you how to use the 2D stuff in Unity, right? Let me show you what it looks like as a finished product, because as a finished product, I was able to finish it for you guys. I've got them under Unity projects. I've got a bunch of them that I've been doing, and I've been doing one of my own that I was going to show you later on. But let's kick off Unity and try this out. So I would go into Unity, so launch Unity with me. Now, if you're using Unity 4, you could certainly convert this project into Unity 4. I believe it's made for Unity 5, but you certainly could take it. What?
It's made for Unity 4.
Is it 4?
Yeah, there's
Okay.
a lot of things that have to change.
That's okay. That's good. So if you're Unity 4, you're good to go. If you're Unity 5, some things you have to there's some minor details you have to change. It's not that big. Actually, Unity will do it for you. Right?
Mostly.
Okay. So let's take a look at this thing and see what I got. Hopefully, it won't crash Yola. So I put the latest version of Unity on. Okay. So let me just make this a little bit smaller for everybody to see. So really, this is it. This is the actual tutorial in a nutshell, right? If you notice, we talked about the hierarchy last time, and now when you look at it, there's nothing here. How come? Well, when you start Unity, remember that you have to save. The first thing you do is you have to save a scene. We're going to talk about it a little bit today. We're going to make some simple scenes again to start getting you going with it. It starts with a scene, right? It's not just saving Unity itself, but you can save all the scenes. Unity may have multiple scenes. Each scene is a screen, right? A start screen, a play screen, level 2, level 3, level 4, an end screen, some transitions. All those are scenes. Here you have one main scene. It's called main. And for us to get to the game, we have to double click on it. All right? There's the game. All right? So if you notice, right now what I'm looking at is the scene window. Okay? There's different windows here. There's the scene window. There's the game window. And if you notice here, we have a UI for some of the stuff that's been added in there, right? You can also tell that Unity is not really rendering this thing at what it's supposed to. It's telling me that it's rendering it smaller at 391 by 586 because my screen, because it's being projected right now, is smaller than it would normally be, right? So if I was actually running this at home, then I would have more real estate and then my screen would be bigger. I don't think I can even get much better than this in this particular state, unless I made my screen smaller, which would be a bad thing for you. Okay, so when I play the game then, what does it look like? Give it a sec. Remember, I'm projecting at the same time. So I'm using my WASD keys, right? My mouse fires, right? And they don't fire back at you, right? They're just asteroids. Got a bit of background noise that you're going to make on your own. You're going to select your own sounds. So what happens if I die? If you notice the explosion is different, right? And game over. I don't have a health in this game. What I'm asking you to do is, maybe this player's going to have a health. Like maybe he's going to get hit more than once before he's the game is over. And you see there's an end game screen or end state where I have to press R to restart. Right, there I am again, right? Pretty standard asteroid destruction, first-person shooter. On the right, if you notice, see how the asteroids are created, and then as they leave the screen, they're cleaned up or destroyed. That's because that's how we take care of asset management here in the game, right? So I can also move forward and back. So I have a little bit of movement. I could avoid things a little bit, but I have some limitations. If I move right to the side, it kind of bounces me out. There's some interesting lighting effects as well with this game because it changes, the lighting changes according to where my ship is. So I can simply avoid this, but I don't get any points, right? Okay, that's enough for this one. So I'm going to stop the simulation. All right, so that's really what you get. You start off with this, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on here. That's why I recommend you haven't done it already, build this one up. Get to this point. Build it up first. Now, if you're the type of person that's a little bit advanced, as you're building this thing up, right, you might all of a sudden start getting ideas of how your next one will work. The smart person will start doing this. I'm going to build 2 projects, Space Shooter and my own. While I'm learning this one, I'm building mine, right? Why not, right? Because then by the time you're done, right? Like you've got a couple things, you're subbing some stuff in, you're changing a few values, and then you're making it work. Why this project? Why just changing what you have up here? From the physical act of changing everything, or the exercise of changing it, you will learn all the things that are part of this whole thing. Let's take a look at some of the scripts. So scripts are in their own folder. If you notice here, like I told you when we met last week for the first time, that if you notice this, my folders here are organized in a very nice fashion. So you have your scenes folder, and I've made I put an underscore in there so it's the top of my hierarchy here in my assets folder, right? My audio, right? So there's your audio for explosions, for asteroids, for enemies, and so on. There's also a done folder. So if you download the assets from the asset store, and this is where you would get this, by the way, all your starting assets come from the Unity asset store for Space Shooter. All right, so they actually give you all this stuff. And they also give you a done version, done materials, done prefabs, done scenes, done scripts. So even if you don't have it, they're done, but remember, they're for Unity 4. So if you're doing Unity 5, there's some modifications you have to put into play, right? There's also something called prefabs. And think about prefabs as classes of objects. So if you notice on the left-hand side, we have a player object on the left, and it's colored in blue. Well, that's because that player object is a prefab. I've created the player object on the right-hand side as an example, and I've made it into a prefab on the left. Okay, let's keep going. If I was going to show you the scripts, if you notice, it starts off just with the player object. That's when they start programming it. And on the right, if you notice, there's a couple things here from a scripts perspective. There's 2 scripts. There's a I'm just going to show you this for a second. If I was open up the scripts, one of them is actually the player controller script. That's the one that we want to look at first. Let's take a look at that one. Right? Now, if you like, I will post my solution for you. I have no problem with that. I will post it up on GitHub for you. Right? I have no issues at all. And here's the reason why. It doesn't matter. Because you're going to have to learn how to do it anyway. Right? So if this helps you, I'll put it up. I have no problem with that. Would you like me to put it up on GitHub? Okay, I'll do that for you today, right? All right, so if you notice, so let's take a look at this. This looks like regular C#, yeah? However, there's a couple things to note here. System serializable, all right? Whenever you see system serializable, and it'll be explained inside the tutorial if you follow it, it's when they want to add something to the inspector that's part of a new class. So here's a class. It's a boundary class, right? And it's something that when we call or we create an object of this boundary class, we want the objects to be included in the inspector. So we make it something called serializable, all right? That's what that does. And what this is actually, it's a filter, right? That's what this thing is, that goes on top of the class. It has to be touching the class, these square brackets. This is a very common construct in C#, right? You may have not seen it yet because it's a little bit advanced from COMP305. But it's actually something quite common if you see square brackets like that, right? It's a modifier, if you will, for the entire class. Sometimes it's a modifier for visibility. Sometimes it's a modifier for authentication. Sometimes it's a modifier for different things. I call it a filter or modifier, right? Okay, then you have your class. Here's your player controller class. It is a subclass of the mono behavior class that all projects start with. I remember I talked about a couple of the API. There's a life cycle to Unity. The Unity life cycle includes some standard methods. One of them is this update method, right? There's actually 3 that are very common. You'll see a lot. One of them is update. There's actually fixed update, and there's another one called start. All right? There's others as well, but those are the main ones. Update is what happens every frame. So every frame, this update fires. Okay? Think about it as an event. Unity is an event-based system. Right? So every frame, 60 frames per second, 60 times a second, this update method fires. it triggers, right? And when this triggers, it follows the code that's inside the code block here. So it says if my input button, get button, fire 1, which is my left mouse button here on my mouse, is true, and it's time for the next firing round, so otherwise they won't let you fire all the time, right? So they actually have a how often you can fire, kind of constraint here, right? And then next fire then is equal to time plus your fire rate, and fire rate is what we define right here as a floating point variable. And by the way, here's a key thing for Unity, and I'm going to stand up for the people that are watching me or listening to me at home with YouTube. I got to point this out. Whenever you see public variables, right? Public variables in a class, when you attach a script to a particular object, they appear in your inspector, right? Private variables are hidden from your inspector. Okay, so those are kind of a new thing you need to take away with this one. So therefore, just at a very high level, I've defined a boundary, which is from this new serialized boundary class that we'll talk about later on, right? Actually, they talk about it in the tutorial, right? And this boundary itself is available on your inspector. So if I go back to Unity and look at the player controller, right, which is right here, and if I look on the right, you can see that boundary, and Unity is smart enough to know that this is a class that includes several properties here, right? You can see that my boundary is, there's a minimum for the X and the Z. That's interesting. X and Z. Remember we talked about how Z is deep, right? It's not up and down like it is in Blender. Blender is Z up. And for Unity, it's Y up, right? So they've actually shifted everything on its side here for this particular game, which is actually a bit of a complication for you if you don't understand how this works, right? So you have X and Z. X is right and left, and Z is up and down in this particular case, right? And you can see that there's -6 from the center is the boundary, and +6 from the center, and this is 6 units in Unity, which would be meters, right? That's how they do it. And the same thing goes with Z min and Z max. Z minimum is -4, and Z max is 8, right? So which means the top. And if you notice, if I play the game again, there's only so far I can go up, right? I can't go further than that, because otherwise I won't give my objects, my hazards, a chance to come into game, right? Make sense? Okay, so that's what those, if I go back to player on the inspector, again, my hierarchy tells me the stuff that's in my game. On the inspector is context sensitive to understand my hierarchy. Guys and girls, if you don't understand this right now, because you're like, holy crap, he's giving us this big project, I don't understand any of that stuff, right? It's okay, because we're going to step through that today, right? Remember, this is doing 2 weeks, right? So it's not like we're 2.5. It's not like you do tomorrow, right? So you don't have to understand all this stuff. It's for you to absorb. It's for you to consume a little bit, right? You need to eat this thing a little bit to understand it, right? You need to get at it, or else you'll never get into it. If we don't get into it this way, then it's going to take us forever to produce something. Okay, remember my goal. My goal is to give you enough assets to fill your boots. It means to fill your little portfolio, right? Okay, so this is what this thing does. So anything we see here in the inspector when we have a script, there's a reflection of it, especially if it's a public variable, that is contained in your scripts. So here's your scripts, and if you notice, I have a speed script, and I go back to my Unity, and then sure enough, there's a speed entry here inside under scripts for my player controller. Okay, so each of these things is something we can modify, and sometimes we want to do that because I'll tell you why. If we were to hard code this, which is also possible, you could just hard code and make it a private variable. Well, you know what? We need to make adjustments, and it's a pain in the ass to make a script adjustment. Whereas if I'm playing, here's something we can do with Unity, just as an aside. I'm playing now, right? All right, so here's my player speed. My player speed is 10. What if I want to make my player speed 20, right? Now what happens? Can I modify my speed right away? Well, yeah, I can make myself way faster in gameplay, right? What if I want to tilt from 4? What if I want to tilt, much more, right? I can do that as I'm playing. And when I stop, and if I go back to my player, nothing has changed. See? I can do that while we go. I can check these things out in gameplay from a debugging perspective, right? And it'll be reflected instantly in gameplay, but it won't actually be reflected back in my code. My code, goes back and defaults to 10, right? So that's why it's really, really important for us to share or expose some of our variables as public instance variables so that they appear here in the inspector. Okay? Some food for you guys. Okay, and we're going to continue to dissect this thing as we go over the next week or two. I'm gonna kind of signal back to talk about the space shooter in more detail, right? But we're going to get there one step at a time. Okay, so again, this is just an example of one script that we build when we build the tutorial. It's called Player Controller, and there's other ones that are random rotator. That's for the asteroids that you see falling down, the hazards. A mover script, destroy by time, destroy by contact, destroy by boundary. Different ways of reutilizing or destroying your objects that are generated for the game. Okay, that's what those scripts do. An example of this would be destroy by time, right? So okay, so here's a destroy by time script. It's very small, right? And we see here that there's a lifetime, right? There's a floating point variable for lifetime that's exposed, that's available on the inspector somehow, right? And what does it say? It says, in my start method, which again, this is one of the lifecycle methods that belong to Unity that you need to know. Remember, start, update, fixed update, and others, right? That we're going to talk about. So when this game starts, destroy a game object, right? Destroy the game object if the lifetime is reached, right? That's what this means, right? So when is this script useful, and when is it used, right? And it's probably going to be used, my guess, is on the hazard, right? And if I look at the asteroid prefab, which is right here, okay, there's several, there's a mover script here, right? There's destroy by contact. I don't see the destroy by time, right? So here's destroy by contact. Where's the destroy by time? When does that kick off, right, as an example? Here's one. There's also this empty object right here. So all you have is a transform to 0, right, as an example. And you have something else, right? It's called a game controller. We're going to talk about these. And you have a hazard that you've made a reference to, which is the asteroid. So it's a prefab, a class, if you will, that you're referencing here in the inspector. And you have a script for game controller. Now, for me to access the script, I can double click here, and it'll take me to this view here. This view, by the way, the ones we've been looking at a very high level, is the mono-develop editor, which is very similar to Visual Studio. Now, if you have access to Visual Studio and you want to use Visual Studio instead of mono-develop, you certainly could, and it gives you additional code hinting. There is a plugin, if you will, an extension for Visual Studio that works nicely with Unity that you can download, and I invite you to take a look at that. All right, so if you notice, this game controller controls different things, right? And it has nothing to do with an actual physical object in the game. And actually, often we have a game controller script that handles things like the shifting of from one scene to the other, right? Controlling things like the score and other things, right? It's done here as a separate item in Unity, as an empty object, if you will, right? It's attached to an empty object in the hierarchy, okay? So again, as you can see, there's a bunch of different public variables, instance variables that are exposed in the inspector. Like, for example, hazard count. Let's go look at that, hazard count variable, right? If I go back to hazard count, I can see that the hazard count is 10. That means the maximum asteroids that I ever get is 10, right? And they kind of get created at different times, right? So it's very interesting the way this is done. There's, you might liken it to, who's ever done Flash in their life? Anybody? Flash, Adobe Flash? If you've done Adobe Flash, it's similar in that, and I don't know, I'm trying to make some similarities for you guys if you've never seen this before. Because we're used to seeing one complete code, like a bunch of code, a big code base. This isn't like that. You have a bunch of disparate scripts that are all part of the same library for your code, right? And what we do is we access those scripts at the game object level. So I make a game object, and I want to move it around. I have a script for that, right? And when the game object comes into being, that script fires. And we're going to talk about that today. That's going to be one of our little activities today to make that happen, right? Okay. So again, very, very high level, but this is why you need to build this thing out. In order for you to understand how to make your own game, you need to build this one, okay? Any questions around this or concerns? No one's got questions. Oh, that's dangerous. That's bad. 9, tell me your questions. You're looking at it like you're, tell me what your problems are.
How does it randomize like where the asteroids spawn?
All right, good question. How does it randomize where the asteroids spawn? Okay, let's take a look at that, right? So we have a random rotator that randomizes how they rotate to make it interesting. We have a spawn weight and a start weight function, right? So here we go. Let's dissect this a little bit more just for you, right? In the start method, which is one of the standard methods in the game lifecycle, right? We set some variables up. We initialize some variables as it starts. We also have something called a coroutine, right? Think about this as a separate thread, right? For some of you who know threading, right? So we have our game loop, and alongside that, we have a coroutine that runs alongside the game loop over here on the other side. And it happens at a different pace than the main game loop happens. So here, our game loop is 60 frames per second, but a coroutine is spawning over here on the other side that has nothing to do with the main game loop, right? And then here's the spawn waves coroutine. The coroutine is actually is right here. When we say start coroutine, we need some kind of method that's an IEnumerator type method. And we'll talk about this, by the way. It's, when you look at C#, you're like, hold on, I've never seen this C# before. Yeah, well, it exists in C#, and if you've done some C# before, whether it's COMP305 or whatever, you can look up what IEnumerator is, right? It's an interface, right? And what it does is it says, hey, spawn waves is of type IEnumerator. And what we're going to do is we're going to wait for a bunch of seconds, as much as start wait. And if I go back to my GameController class for a second, so here's my GameController. And if I say start wait is 1 second. So I wait 1 second. That's how much I'm going to wait for. And then I'm going to start off my hazards. They're going to be starting to be generated. And I generate them by using the instantiate keyword. It's actually a class of its own, a static class that I can spawn or instantiate objects that are prefabs into my world, right? So that's how I do it. I have a prefab, I've created an object, right? And then once I've created the object, how it moves, and all the scripts around it, it's encapsulated. I can generate as many of those objects as I want by using the instantiate keyword. Okay? Again, you would learn this when you do the tutorial. Okay, this is all in the tutorial, how to do this kind of stuff. Again, he talks at a very high level, and we're going to dissect it a little bit more when you guys do the tutorial. That's why it would have been good to do it so we can talk about it. Okay. And if you notice, input.getKeyDown code R, key code R means the R key, right? Input.getKeyDown key code R, right? And then when that's done, it says application load level. That's how we restart the game. And then application loaded level is what we want to say. We want to reload the application or restart the game. And that's if restart is equal to true. Okay? So any other questions before we go on? I can continue doing this, but it'll make your eyes bleed, right? I don't want that. Like, you guys can figure some of this out on your own. And it seems heavy duty. It's not. Don't be afraid of it. This is exactly what you've known from before with C#. And if you've known three-dimensional worlds, we're going to talk a little bit slower now. We're going to take it back a notch, right? And work with some primitives today to try and do some of this work right now. Remember, I gave you 2 assignments last for 2 things to learn. So one of them was this tutorial here, right, Space Shooter, and the other one I gave you to do was Rollerball. Who got done with Rollerball? Okay, some of you did. That's good. Some of you did Rollerball. That's a great starting one. Rollerball. If you could do Rollerball first, it's different because it's 3D instead of 2D, but it gives you the rudiments of each one of them. Gives you a little bit more stuff to learn, right? Like Rollerball, what it does is it talks about colliders a little bit more, right? It talks about some basics in Rollerball. Let me load that one up for a second so you guys see what that one looks like, and then I'll pause the movie and we'll take a short break. Okay. All right. So I'm going to quit Unity for a second, and I'm going to reload it. I'm going to go back into reload Unity from the bottom. And we're going to go into the Rollerball example here. And I'll just minimize this stuff. All right, here's Rollerball. right? Now, rollerball is much easier, and it's set up a little bit different. Now, every tutorial author does things slightly differently. If you notice, this author, he likes to do things with this viewport default layout, right? Remember, I'm telling you, I like the 2x3. You might eventually like the 2x3 or the default view. This is the default view, okay? If I was to switch to 2x3, it would look a little differently, right? It would look like this. In this particular case, I'm just going to go back to the default, all right? Here we are. So again, they've organized things here in scenes. So for me to start this tutorial, I'd have to look at the main game scene. If I load this up, you can see that the main game scene loads up. And the hierarchy fills with different objects that have been included. For example, there is a UI object, which is embedded under, which is a child of the canvas. Hey, here's something new that you haven't seen before. You've got a hierarchy, and underneath that, you have other objects. These objects are said to be parented to the other object that's outside of it, right? So canvas is the parent. Count text and win text are the children of the parent, and they're different objects that appear in your scene. Same thing with your pickups. There's a bunch of pickups. Pickups is a empty object, and we've grouped all the other pickups. These 11 pickups or 12 pickups here, 11 I believe it is. We've grouped all these pickups in this pickups group. It's just an empty object, and if I was to click on this, you can see all we have is the transform component, right? Remember that every object in Unity, at the very minimum, has a transform component. Okay. And we have walls and so on. And if you notice, every wall, it's just a grouping. There's the west wall, right, and the east wall. And if I was to kind of zoom out a little bit so you can see it, and I'm going to just spin around so you can see what this looks like here, right? So here's my default setting here, right? Look at it like this, where I have my x coordinate going right and left, and my z coordinate going forward and back. You can see that I can look at it from that perspective for sure. And I can select different items on my scene in this scene window by selecting by left clicking here, right? Or you could certainly just click inside the hierarchy itself to select, right? Now if I play this scene, right? Here it is. There's no sound to speak of, but I have a roller ball, and I'm going to start collecting items by rolling over them. Right? Now if you know, it's not exactly easy because I have a bit of momentum that I impart to my ball. It keeps rolling if I stop pressing the button. Like watch, I'm pressing the button, now I'm stopping. And it'll keep going, and it'll slow down depending on the friction of the item, right? So this is kind of a little neat tutorial to learn as well. So this is the first tutorial that we did. Okay, this is kind of cool. And if I was to go to scripts, there's a few scripts here. There's the player controller script, and hey, look at this. There's also a game controller for this one. Let's take a look at the player controller for this script, right? Now, you might say there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? But again, some of these things are very similar. Like, for example, the start method. The start method is the same method as part of our, what we call the Unity lifecycle, the game lifecycle. There's fixed update. There's two updates, fixed update and update. We're going to talk about the difference between the two. And there's also different collider events that are standard. One of them is called onTriggerEnter, right, which is a standard method that's part of the Unity lifecycle to detect if a collider is entered or enter the space, if you will, or the collider of another trigger, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so that's really that's in the game controller in a nutshell, or the player controller. And this also has, if you notice here in MonoDevelop, it also shows you the rollerball hierarchy on the left-hand side. Here's the project, right? And then underneath that, you can see the different scripts associated with the project. The game controller script, so here's the camera controller script, and the rotator. Okay, so here's the rotator script. There it is, right? Take a look. And the rotator says, hey, on update, right? Whatever object this script is attached to, rotate, transform rotate, a new vector 3 by changing the x, y, and z coordinates, the rotation, right, over time, delta time, which means every second, or every millisecond, every tick, if you will. Okay, and this rotator class, if you will, this little script is attached to my objects here. So if I go to, if I go back to prefabs, I look that I have a pickup object, right? And again, remember, we create our objects first, make them into prefabs. This is what I was saying, right? We're going to look at that today. And then you see the rotator script is attached to this pickup object. That means when a pickup, that's what they call these objects, is created, right? As soon as they're created, we run the rotator script. So it starts to rotate. That's how it works. Because the rotator script, if I go back to monodevelop, is inside the update function. Every update, as soon as every frame, if you will, this thing is called. So 60 frames a second, it's going to change. It's going to create a new vector, a vector 3, for it to rotate around this object. All right. So it's going to take this rotation, the rotate method of the class transform, the transform component, and it's going to change the X, Y, and Z rotations every frame. That's what this is doing. Okay. Again, enough about this. You guys are looking at me with like I have 4 heads, right? Because you don't understand how this is happening. You're like, what is this stuff that he talks of? We've never even covered this. You know, yes, you're right. We haven't covered it. But if you did the tutorials, I hate to rang on you guys, but it's important you do what I ask you to do. All right, let's get back. So I've done a couple things here, and in this video, we've talked about our first assignment number 1, right? And assignment number 1 to produce this 2D space shooter or a shooter game is what it should be called, a 2D shooter of your own choice, right? Based on the space shooter game. I'm going to put up the space shooter code in its own little repository for you to access. You can certainly download or fork, right? It's my completed code that works with Unity 5, right? So if you're a Unity 5 person, great. If not, and then you can check my code versus what they tell you on the tutorial, right? I want you to have some kind of reference for that for sure, but you should totally do it on your own. Okay, I'm going to stop broadcasting this one, and we'll come back with some simple objects.